Hello and welcome. The name of this case is not clear. This is most likely an OEM part. I happened to run into this case on AliExpress while searching for a decent small form factor case, and this goes by many names. Therefore, this case is best recognized by its design instead of its name. But the listing I purchased this from claimed that this is SKTC A17 case. Another similar listing claimed a different name for this case, so that's that. Costing 80 Canadian rubles after a coupon, price-wise, this is a decent case. I was especially impressed after receiving the case because the finish does seem decent. Anyway, at 7.5 liters, this case is quite small and portable. It has even got a handle as well. But the real advantage of this case is somewhere else. Before revealing that, allow me to compare this case with other cases of similar sizes. The one on the left is ViewNote X230, a 6 liters case, and the one on the right is Johnsbow C6, a 16 liters case. There doesn't seem to be that much difference between a 6 liters case and a 7.5 liters case. But the SKTC A17 allows a tower layout, meaning you won't need a PCI Express ribbon cable. In contrast, the size difference is vividly clear with Johnsbow C6. After all, C6 is twice in volume. As with all small form factor cases, there are several things you need to keep in your mind. First of all, forget cable management. A 7.5 liters case is an extremely small one for what this is capable of. I foresee struggles ahead. How bad it is going to be, we will see. The manual does indicate that this is in fact SKTC A17. You also see a hard drive/SSD bracket. You will want to discard it because it is going to be insanely messy otherwise. You want to clear out as much space as possible. The I/O cables are longer than I was hoping for. Half of its length would have been perfect. The power supply will go on the front, and I don't expect much of space to work with, if any at all. This is the power supply bracket. It's for a SFX power supply only, although you may be able to use a flex power supply with an adapter. There is no physical space at all for a regular power supply. This was my first attempt. I say first because this build proved to be far more troublesome than it initially appeared. Anyway, I am using ID cooling IS67, and this orientation of the cooler prevents the power cord to be secured. I will have to rotate it around. With the cooler rotated, it was possible to have it almost done. But, at this point already, the power supply cables were too much. I had barely any wiggle room, and I am about to add a NVIDIA 5060 single fan edition. Additionally, you have to take out the power supply to put the motherboard into the case, and installing the power supply afterwards proved to be royal pain in the backside. There was simply not enough room. This is normally not a problem, but this case requires you to use a 180-degree power adapter for the GPU due to its size. Fortunately, they include the adapter. Finally, I was going to add an 80mm fan, but with the mess inside, I chose not to. Actually, I was skeptical that this would even turn on at this point because I literally wrestled with the cables to get everything in. I felt that I knocked out the power button cable. Yep, I thought so. I must have knocked out the power button cable. To correct that mishap, I will need to take out the GPU and the power supply along with all other cables to be able to clearly see what goes where. That much work for a simple problem meant that I chose not to go any further with this setup. This build took a lot out of me, and I took a break after this. I could certainly make it work, but felt that it was not practical. Every time something goes wrong, I would need to dismantle everything. Now, the primary issue is space or the lack thereof. This means that I will need to change the CPU cooler with something smaller and use even a smaller GPU. This is my second attempt with a different set of hardware. ID Cooling IS67 is replaced with Noctua NHL9, and the GPU is replaced with a low-profile one. With space saved from swapping out those two, I was able to manage the cables somewhat okay-ish, and was able to complete this. The most significant difference from before is that the cables now have spaces to be. It's still cramped, but it is workable. Remember that this is a 7.5 liters case, which is barely larger than those 5 liters cases, where you have to use a ribbon cable to connect a GPU. All done with an 80mm fan in the back. It is now time to test this thing and see how it performs. I don't expect any problem for the GPU, but 7000 to 9000 series Ryzen CPUs don't fare well with smaller heatsinks. I am expecting mediocre turbo clock speed therefore. It's powering on this round. Even if it didn't, it wouldn't take me long to fix it with cables now somewhat loose. There was absolutely no space to work previously. I couldn't even get a finger in. Well, under ideal conditions, the maximum all-core turbo clock should be 5.2 GHz. It is hitting around 4.95 GHz with TJ max of 95 degrees Celsius. It's not too bad, given the circumstances, but I am sure that it would have been better with those 5-liter cases, because those cases let CPU breathe outside air directly. And, as far as GPU is concerned, there is absolutely no issue whatsoever. It's maxing out at around 65 degrees Celsius. GPU is breathing outside air due to the layout. At the end of the day, I am not sure whether I can recommend this. For the record, I do like the tower layout and that I don't have to use a ribbon cable. However, I feel strongly that 7.5 liters is a bit too little for this case to shine. I do recall making a statement that 10 liters is the sweet spot for a small form factor case with a tower layout. A case like Metalfish T40, which is a 7 liters case, is just so much better than this in almost all aspects. T40 does need a PCI ribbon cable however, and that's about the only aspect it loses out to this SKTC A17 case. If you ask me how I could improve this case, I would say that making this a bit larger would solve the majority of the problems. I have fairly thin fingers, and I simply could not work it with the first set of hardware. I had to downgrade both CPU heatsink as well as GPU to make room to work with. Well, thank you for watching.